Resident Evil 7 will be out very soon, so I wanted to take some time to talk about Resident Evil as a whole, and what it is to be a Resident Evil game. What makes Resident Evil Resident Evil? That's honestly a really loaded question because this new generation I don't think has played the original games, or at least they don't acknowledge them all that well, and if you do, it's not really the same formula it was back then. It's not those same early days of survival horror, and really survival horror in general has changed, as gaming generations have flipped time and time again. Games have evolved, and sometimes not for the best, but to me and my own opinion, we are going to talk about what I feel makes a Resident Evil game. First off, right off the bat, it's the setting. You have to have that survival horror game feel to it. The environment has to be dark and bloody. It has to look like you were dropped into a world of despair. In the earlier games, that meant being in a post-apocalyptic town known as Raccoon City. And really, the earlier games revolved around that city and what it was, and it was awesome. The later games changed up the environment entirely. You had more of an open-style sort of game, and it was less about the dark, closed-off environments that we were all used to, and it took a much more action-oriented approach. Its gameplay approach was less intent on the survival aspect of things, which I personally did not like. From 4 on up, I didn't feel like it was survival horror anymore. It was there, but it was very loosely there. I did like the later games for what they were, but for different reasons. Overall, I feel that Resident Evil is most on point in Raccoon City. You need to have those closed-off corridors, hallways, and alleyways. There was just something truly special about traveling down these areas in the earlier games that gave you a spark of adrenaline rush and fear that overcame you in the forefront of your mind. The next thing that makes Resident Evil what it is to me is the item and ammo conservation. If we are talking about a good old Resident Evil game, it has to have that fear of running out of ammo in the back of your mind. Always trying to save that last little bit of handgun bullets, or saving that special ammo for that boss. It's trying to keep enough first aid sprays to get you through the undead hell that you are experiencing, to find the next little bit of first aid sprays or herbs. And often that's what it is that saves you. You had to find that good old balance between the two. And you also had a very limited inventory space. So you had to really choose wisely and plan out what you really wanted. Your course of action and what you carried around really meant what it was to survive and thrive on the environment. Up next is the camera. In the earlier games, you had these fixated camera angles. That's right, there was no over-the-shoulder camera going on. You had this angle that you had to deal with, and it was constant as you traveled throughout the game. That's pretty much unheard of now. But it was that camera angle that helped form what Resident Evil was in my eyes. As a kid, half the experience was not knowing what was around that corner, or not knowing what was just out of frame of that camera. It played on your fear that you couldn't see the whole picture. What was going to jump out at you and scare you next? What was going to catch you off guard? In the newer games, it just did not have that level of fear. It was more about shooting and barreling on to the next area. The newer games just had a whole different tone to them, and the camera angles were a big part of the old games. There were a whole lot of complaints about the fixated cameras though, but I did enjoy it. In my opinion, those earlier games would not be complete without those fixated cameras. It wouldn't have the same level of atmosphere to me. It really added something to the formula that we just don't get these days. I do understand why it had to be changed and evolved, but for me, I loved them more than complaining about them. Next up are the controls. And yes, they have aged extremely poorly. You would never get away with those type of controls these days, and it did have a factor of frustration even back then. It didn't really bother me that much as a kid, because back then gaming was different, and there wasn't many experiences like Resident Evil out there at the time. This was new, and Silent Hill had the same type of controls. The tank controls were not really that new. I mean, other games have did it before then. I think Alone in the Dark did the controls first, but Resident Evil and Silent Hill did adopt the controls afterwards. Gaming was just a different place back then, and a lot of people were still figuring out how controls worked in games. Everyone was still getting their footings and everything was still early in development. I can't really say that the tank controls of Resident Evil really added a layer to it, and I definitely would have not missed them, but they were still part of the original games. I've heard of people getting upset about the concept of removing the tank controls in updated versions of the older games, and if I put on my nostalgic glasses, I might feel a twinge of the same thing, but ultimately, most of the time I try to look through my realistic glasses, and I think the controls evolving away from the tank controls were ultimately a good decision. This next one I consider a big part of Resident Evil and what it means to me: the puzzles. It's definitely one of the core elements in the earlier games. The later games did have puzzles as well, but those earlier days of puzzles were something else completely different. Yes, little kid me did not really appreciate a lot of those puzzles back then, and sometimes I did need a guide because I was stuck on something, but man did I appreciate those ones I could figure out, and it did add a depth and layer for me to the games. It gives off a sense of being in this undead world where the dead are running rampant, and you have to solve the puzzles in this world as the dead track you down, and the only way to get through them is to solve these puzzles and move on to the next area. There was just a sense of urgency. Not like today where you're mowing down most of the zombies with guns and moving on to the next area. You had to really use your mind. It was a little bit frustrating back then because you didn't have smartphones and it wasn't that easy to just look it up online like it is these days. If I was stuck on a puzzle, I had to wait until I was able to get online, or I had to go to the bookstore and try to find the guide that would help me. So yes, puzzles were annoying sometimes, but it gave that extra oomph to the game that it needed. And as I grew older, I began to really appreciate the puzzles in the games. It also gave you a reason to explore and search the whole environment as much as possible. You had to read everything to find passkeys and codes, and you had to collect all the emblems and key items and stuff you need to open doors. I don't know why I would need this battery or random cable, but I always grabbed it because sooner or later you would need it and it would become handy. Ultimately, the puzzles helped you explore more of the game, and it encouraged you to go out and find every little thing you possibly could, because it was necessary. Next up, saving. These days you have autosaves everywhere in every single game. We don't really think about it too often, but the earlier games required you to save in a safe room, with a typewriter, and you could only do it if you had an ink ribbon. It gave you this real sense of fear that you could die without saving, and if you did, it could easily set you back 20 or 30 minutes at a time, depending on when you last saved. So there was a real sense of urgency to get to that typewriter. There were things you had to get done that were really important, and you always had to have that safe room in the back of your mind, because if you're on your way to that safe room, anything could jump out at you and try to kill you, and trust me, there are plenty of things that can do that. Next up, choices. The Resident Evil games from earlier on gave you choices and things that could lead to different outcomes. The games all had different endings depending on the choices that you made, and I don't just mean who to save or the big choices either. I mean the small choices as well. You might not have noticed in the earlier games, but you could definitely pick certain rooms or certain ways to do things that would help you get better things or extra items you could use along the way. The game can reward you or give you a certain consequence for going a certain way or doing something different. It really did mix it up and it made it really interesting. And I didn't really learn about certain things you could do or different ways you could do things until much later on after I have completed all the earlier games. So this was definitely a nice thing for me to find out. I just wish I knew it back then when I first played them. Lastly, the thing that makes Resident Evil the most Resident Evil to me are the zombies. Now hear me out. I know that the games have evolved and become something much different. It went from being zombie to simply just being infected. Not really zombies per se, more like infected self-aware hosts. But Resident Evil to me, at its core, has always been about zombies to me. That's what made the game for me personally. It's the one big aspect on why I don't like a lot of the newer games. I was ultimately okay with a lot of the other changes that they made, but it became less Resident Evil to me because they lost zombies. It was unfortunate in my eyes. Lost plagas or whatever you want to call them, they're not really zombies. I guess my definition of zombies would be something different. I guess the definition of this thing taking over someone's body and mind and controlling them in this new state could technically be called a zombie. But to me, a zombie is always a mindless, flesh-eating, bloody mess of a former person that is now dead, and all they want to do is consume your flesh and eat your brains. I don't know why they moved away from the traditional zombie enemy. Maybe they felt they had to mix it up or whatever, but I don't like it, and I've never really liked it. It's the one thing that the recent games have always really rubbed me the wrong way. Don't get me wrong, I still really much enjoy the newer Resident Evil games, and yes, I may even be thinking with nostalgia in mind, but it was those earlier games and the mechanics within them that made Resident Evil what it is. That is what this series built its foundation on, and then they built a whole new foundation. You will still see some of the same things like first aid sprays and herbs, and even some of the same characters and so on, but the formula that is used is a very different formula, and I'm not complaining per se. Like I said in the beginning of the video, gaming has evolved, and with it has brought many different concepts to the table, and it has redefined how we see certain genres. I didn't personally enjoy the Resident Evil games from 4 and on the same way I enjoyed the earlier ones. I liked them in a very different way, and I still think they're great games for what they are, but they just aren't Resident Evil-esque enough to me. They stand on their own for different reasons than the earlier games stand on their own. They are great action games, and some of them even have zombies in them. Resident Evil 6 had the traditional approach to zombies, with more of the recent formula in mind. However, this new game coming out soon, Resident Evil 7, looks to be an evolution to what Resident Evil is, and I think it's going in the right direction. It looks creepy and has a level of fear that we haven't seen in Resident Evil in a very long time. It's definitely more about survival horror again than its action-packed games of recent years. It seems to have a good balance between fast action sequences, like chases and games of cat and mouse, some good old puzzles thrown into the mix, and even some parts that feel reminiscent of playing Resident Evil 3, when you were being hunted down by Nemesis, which I loved a lot. The new game feels much truer to Resident Evil than the series has in a very long time. But at the same time, it feels very much a different beast. But I don't see that as a bad thing, as I do believe gaming does need to evolve sometimes. You can't always keep the same formula over and over, I do understand that. This new game definitely has some old and fresh concepts. I look at it as a fresh take on old survival horror, something more based around the original games, and also adding a bit of shock value of its own. Think of it kind of like Chainsaw Massacre thrown into the mix, because that's instantly what it reminded me of. Seeing this family sit around this table, it really adds that kind of element to the game. I'm not sure how much it's based on zombies, and I don't think it's hugely based on it. It seems to be more revolved and tightly based on this one family, but I think that's good because it tells this tale, and it's not the same rehashing of some zombie story. I do believe that Resident Evil at its core is about zombies, but this new game adds a ton of atmosphere of its own. The new tension that it builds and its always evolving concepts, I think I'm really gonna love this new game, and I did love all the originals as well. I believe this new game is gonna stand in its own light, as I believe all these games actually stand on their own, except for Umbrella Corps. We are not gonna talk about that. And even though this series has more than one foundation, I believe they all work together in their own way. I do understand some fans getting upset about them changing the formula so much, but I'm not one of those type of people. I like both concepts of what they have created. I like the action games and I also like the horror games. It's all the same but also very different from one another, if that makes any sense. Ultimately, this video is me talking about what makes the games for me personally. I just wanted to talk about it because this new game is coming out and I kinda wanted to explore back a little bit on what made Resident Evil at the time, and what it is now. I am very grateful that I grew up in a time where I was able to play the original games as they were being released. Some of these newer fans grew up playing the Resident Evil 4 and 5 as they were released. To each their own, and I can respect the fans that have grew up on the 4 and 5 rather than the original games. It's just a different generation and I cannot fault that. I can see why they were popular and I can see why they would be fan favorites. Overall, we all have our favorite games in the series. We all have opinions. And I think most of us, more than anything, are excited about this new game. So drop a comment and a like on the video and let me know what your favorite Resident Evil game is. Thanks for watching guys, and please subscribe if you like this content. You guys have a good day and a good night.